All right, so we've got Sam Houston making the trek to Las Cruces to face New Mexico State. And this line is telling a completely different story than what the power rankings suggest. Sam Houston opened as 3.5-point road favorites. But here's the thing. The computer models actually have New Mexico State as the better team when you factor in that massive 3.1 home field advantage. So what are we looking at here? Sam Houston is sitting at 0-4 after getting absolutely demolished by Texas, 55-0. I mean, they managed 17 yards on their first 15 plays with 0 first downs. That's rough. But here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes a team getting boat raced by elite competition doesn't tell us much about how they'll perform against more comparable opponents. New Mexico State, meanwhile, just got throttled by Liberty 49-14 in their Conference USA opener. Logan Fife threw for 278 yards, but was wildly inaccurate at 48.5% completion, and those 2 picks were absolute killers. Plus, they had a fumble return for a touchdown in the fourth quarter, which is just, you can't do that stuff and expect to win games. But here's what's fascinating about this matchup. We're talking about 2 teams that have shown they can move the ball when they're not turning it over. P.J. Johnson III had 159 receiving yards for New Mexico State, so there's talent there. The question is whether either team can clean up the mental mistakes. Now, the situational stuff is huge here. Sam Houston's coming off a bye week, which should help with preparation and getting guys healthy, but they're making a 670-mile trip to 3,970 feet of altitude in Las Cruces. That altitude factor is real. It affects conditioning, ball flight, the whole deal. Weather-wise, we're looking at pretty ideal conditions. 74 degrees at kickoff, winds around 8 miles per hour from the southeast with some gusts up to 17. That might make deep balls a little trickier and could affect long field goals, but nothing that should drastically change game plans. Here's my read on the value. This 3.5-point spread feels way too high for Sam Houston on the road. The power rankings suggest New Mexico State should actually be favored by about 0.5 point at home. That's a 4-point swing we're talking about. The market seems to be overreacting to Sam Houston's recent schedule strength. Yeah, they got crushed by Texas, but that tells us more about Texas than it does about Sam Houston. New Mexico State's loss to Liberty is arguably more concerning because that's the level of competition they'll be facing regularly. I'm looking at New Mexico State plus 3.5 as having legitimate value here. Both teams have offensive weapons, but struggle with turnovers and defensive consistency. In a game like this, the team that gets the benefit, a home field advantage, and the points is where I want to be. The Aggies get their guys back home after a brutal road loss, and sometimes that's exactly when a team bounces back. So here we are, South Florida hosting Charlotte in what looks like a complete mismatch on paper, but let me tell you why this line might actually be telling us something interesting. First off, let's talk about what just happened to both these teams. South Florida got absolutely demolished by Miami, 35-6, and that loss was even uglier than the score suggests. They got outscored 64-6 over their last 60 minutes of play against Miami dating back to last season. That's just brutal, right? But here's the thing, and this is where it gets interesting for us. Miami is a completely different animal than Charlotte. We're talking about a team that just hung 50 on Florida A&M versus a Charlotte squad that managed 17 points and didn't score their first touchdown until 7 minutes left in the fourth quarter against Middle Tennessee State. The quarterback situation in Charlotte is a complete mess. They used 2 different quarterbacks against Middle Tennessee, with Grayson Loftus getting most of the work but looking pedestrian at best. Meanwhile, they've got Connor Harrell on the bench, who threw for 382 yards the week before against Monmouth, but he only got 8 attempts. That screams coaching staff uncertainty. And uncertainty at quarterback usually means one thing: inconsistent offensive execution. Now, South Florida's got their own issues. Byron Brown's interception streak ended at the worst possible time against Miami. But here's what the casual bettor might be missing. They showed they can still generate explosive plays. 4 passes over 25 yards, including a 53-yarder to Chaz Nimrod, against Miami's defense. So what happens when they face Charlotte's secondary? The power rankings have this as a blowout territory matchup, and honestly, I think they're right. But the weather factor here is fascinating. 19-mile-per-hour winds during the day, settling to 14 during game time, with gusts up to 20. And that's coming from the east-northeast, which means the kicking game gets interesting real quick. Charlotte's one bright spot has been Liam Boyd, who went 3 of 4 on field goals with a 40-yard long against Middle Tennessee. But with these wind conditions, those longer attempts become much more questionable. And for a team that's already struggling to find the end zone consistently, well, you can see where this is going. South Florida's coming off a bye week, which gives them time to lick their wounds and prepare. Charlotte's making a 516-mile trip, which isn't ideal, but it's not a deal-breaker either. The real issue is Charlotte starting 0-1 in American Conference play. They're already in a hole, and facing a South Florida team that just got embarrassed on national television, that's not a recipe for an upset. The market's got perfect alignment between the power rankings and the betting line here, which usually means the sharp money agrees with the initial assessment. South Florida's home field advantage is below average at just 2.4 points, but when you're already projected to win big, that doesn't really matter. Here's my read on the value. Charlotte's shown they can't sustain drives against conference-level competition. Their quarterback situation is unstable, and they're facing a team that desperately needs to bounce back after getting humiliated. Meanwhile, South Florida's got the bye week advantage. They've shown they can generate big plays even when everything else is falling apart, and they're at home with something to prove. The win could keep this game a bit more grounded than expected, which might favor the under if you're looking at the total. But as for the side, I think the power rankings have this one pegged correctly. All right, so we've got Western Kentucky making the trek to Delaware on Saturday, and the market has completely missed the mark on this one. I'm talking about a 4-point discrepancy between what the power rankings say and where the books have this line set. Delaware opened as 3-point home favorites, which, honestly, that feels light when you dig into what these teams actually are. Western Kentucky just pulled off this incredible comeback against Nevada, trailing 13-10 heading into the fourth, then absolutely demolished them 21-3 in the final frame. That's not just scoring, that's systematic domination when it mattered most. The thing that jumps out about that WKU performance is how they did it. 2 methodical drives in the fourth quarter, 85 yards in 9 plays, then 87 yards in 14 plays. That's ground and pound football when the game's on the line. Lavelle Wright with 2 rushing touchdowns, George Hart III adding another. This isn't some one-dimensional passing attack that folds under pressure. Now, Delaware's coming off a bye week, which typically gives you that extra preparation edge, but here's where it gets interesting. They just demolished FIU 38-14, and their red zone efficiency was absolutely ridiculous. 5 of 6 red zone trips turned into touchdowns. That's elite execution inside the 20. But here's my issue with backing Delaware at this number. Their big momentum swing came against FIU. Not exactly elite competition. 21 unanswered points in the second quarter, including a 68-yard punt return touchdown. When you're getting explosive plays like that against weaker competition, it can mask some underlying issues. Western Kentucky's power ranking separation isn't huge, but it's real. And when you factor in that they just showed they can execute under pressure, I mean, that fourth quarter performance against Nevada was textbook. You start to wonder if this Delaware line is more about recent perception than actual ability. The weather's going to be perfect, by the way. 55 degrees at kickoff, winds at 4 miles per hour from the southwest. This is pure fall football conditions, so no external factors to worry about. Here's what I keep coming back to. Western Kentucky's balanced attack and their ability to control games late. Maverick McIver throwing for 216, multiple rushing threats. And then there's their special teams, which literally scored a touchdown on a 50-yard return of an onside kick. That's the kind of unexpected value that can flip spreads. Delaware's definitely got talent. Nick Menikuchi, with 218 passing yards and 3 touchdowns, shows they can move the ball. But Western Kentucky just proved they can win games in the fourth quarter against decent competition. While Delaware's dominant performance came against a team that's, well, let's just say FIU isn't exactly testing your championship medal. The 610-mile trip for Western Kentucky is worth noting, but with that negative 1-hour time adjustment, they're actually gaining an hour. That's not the travel disadvantage it initially appears to be. Look, Delaware gets their standard 2.5 points for home field advantage. But when the power rankings are screaming that Western Kentucky should be favored and the market has Delaware laying 3, that's a 4-point swing in value. In college football, that's massive. I think this comes down to execution in critical moments, and Western Kentucky just showed they've got that clutch gene. Their 3-1 record with building momentum, coming off a game where they dominated when it mattered most, versus Delaware coming off a bye after beating up on lesser competition. The value's on the Hilltoppers here, and it's significant. So you've got two teams coming off nail-biters against FCS opponents, and honestly, that tells us everything we need to know about where this game's headed. New Mexico just squeaked past Idaho State 28-22, and San Jose State needed a last-second 48-yard field goal to beat Idaho by 3. When you're struggling against teams that shouldn't even be on your schedule, well, that's when you start finding value in the betting markets. Let me break down what actually happened in these games, because the box scores don't tell the whole story. New Mexico's got this transfer running back, Skyler Humphrey, who absolutely exploded for 141 yards and 2 touchdowns. The guy ripped off a 61-yard run that basically saved their season opener. But here's the thing. They let Idaho State score on 3 straight drives around halftime. Against an FCS team, that's not exactly inspiring defensive football. San Jose State's situation is even more concerning. They allowed 28 points to Idaho and managed to force exactly 1 punt in the entire second half. 1 punt! Their saving grace was Jabari Bates, who had a career day with 131 yards on just 11 carries, including an 87-yard house call. But when you need your running back to break an 87-yarder just to stay competitive with Idaho, that's telling you something about the overall state of your offense. Now the market's got San Jose State laying 2.5 at home, and I'm looking at this thinking the power rankings actually support the Spartans here. They're getting the standard home field advantage, plus they grade out slightly better overall. But, and this is a big but, we're talking about two teams that just showed us they can barely handle FCS competition. What's really interesting is the weather situation. 56 degrees at kickoff, basically no wind, perfect conditions for football. So we can throw out any environmental factors. This comes down to pure execution, and based on what we just saw, both of these offenses are going to move the ball. The narrative everyone's focusing on is New Mexico's long trip, 865 miles from Albuquerque to San Jose. That's a legitimate factor, especially for a program that's still figuring things out under new head coach Jason Eck. Getting that first win was huge for momentum, but now they've got to travel across multiple time zones and play a team that, despite their struggles, still managed to find a way to win when it mattered. Here's where I'm landing on this. Both defenses just got carved up by teams they should have shut out. New Mexico's allowing big plays. San Jose State can't get off the field on 3rd down. The total's sitting in the mid-50s range, and I think that's actually undervaluing what we're about to see. You've got Humphrey showing he can break one at any moment for New Mexico, and Bates just proved he's got game-breaking speed for the Spartans. Neither defense has shown they can consistently stop anybody, and we're looking at two offenses that, while inconsistent, have clear explosive playmakers. The spread feels about right. San Jose State should win this game at home, but 2.5 points doesn't give you much margin for error when you're talking about teams this evenly matched in terms of, well, mediocrity. The real value might be looking at that total and asking yourself, if these teams just gave up a combined 50 points to FCS opponents, what happens when they play each other? This feels like a game that goes over the number, with San Jose State covering at home but not by much. Two teams that can't stop anybody. Perfect weather conditions, and playmakers on both sides who've already shown they can create big plays. Yeah, I think we're looking at a shootout that the Spartans win by a field goal or less. So here's the deal with this West Virginia-BYU matchup. We've got a team that just got absolutely shellacked in their Big 12 opener, traveling across the country to face an undefeated squad that's looking like one of the most complete teams nobody's talking about. West Virginia's 41-10 loss to Kansas last week wasn't just bad, it was everything falling apart at once. And I mean everything. Their defense, which came into that game 4th in the country with 13 sacks, didn't record a single quarterback takedown against Kansas. Not one. They gave up 242 rushing yards, and honestly, watching Jelon Daniels pick them apart was painful. But here's what really caught my attention. Rich Rodriguez didn't sugarcoat it afterward. Quote, nothing was good. Coaching, not good. Playing, not good. When a coach throws his entire program under the bus like that after a conference opener, you're looking at deeper issues than just a bad game. Now BYU, they're sitting pretty at 3-0, and their defense has been absolutely suffocating. 16 points allowed through 3 games. That's not a typo. They've stopped teams twice inside the 10-yard line, including goal line stands that show serious red zone discipline. And Bear Bachmeier, their freshman quarterback, just had his first road test and looked completely comfortable. Here's where it gets interesting for bettors, though. The market has BYU laying 6.5, but my power ranking suggests they should be laying closer to 7.5. So we're getting slight value on the favorite here, which doesn't happen often. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, this travel situation. West Virginia's making a 1,675-mile trip with a 2-hour time adjustment, going from sea level to 4,600 feet of elevation. That's not just numbers on a spreadsheet. That's real physiological impact when you're trying to execute at game speed. The weather's actually going to be perfect. 50 degrees at kickoff, maybe 8-mile-per-hour winds, so no excuses there. But when you combine the travel fatigue with the defense that just got torched by Kansas. I mean, BYU's offense isn't Kansas, but they don't need to be explosive when they're this disciplined. What really sells me on BYU here is the timing. West Virginia's got Utah coming to town next week, which means they can't afford to sleepwalk through this one and dig themselves an even deeper hole in conference play. But BYU? They're opening Big 12 play themselves at home, riding perfect momentum. The home field advantage in Provo is worth about 2.7 points, which is more than your typical college venue. Factor in the elevation, the travel, and West Virginia's complete defensive breakdown last week, and this feels like a spot where BYU doesn't just win, they make a statement. I'm seeing a scenario where BYU's defense continues this dominant run, while West Virginia's offense, which managed just 227 total yards through 3 quarters against Kansas, struggles to find any rhythm at altitude. Rich Rodriguez can criticize his team all he wants, but fixing systemic issues doesn't happen in 1 week of practice. All right, let's break down why San Diego State minus 4.5 might be the most interesting line of the week. We've got Colorado State making that 856-mile trek to face an Aztecs team that just dropped an absolute statement win on Cal. Now, here's what caught my eye immediately. San Diego State just recorded their first shutout against a power conference opponent since 1975. That's not just good defense, that's historic defense. And we're talking about a Cal team that had won their first 3 games by double digits before getting completely shut down 31-0. But here's where it gets really interesting for us as bettors. Colorado State is coming off another heartbreaker, losing 17-16 to UTSA after a failed 2-point conversion with 29 seconds left. That's their second close loss this season, and honestly, that kind of thing gets in your head. The quarterback situation in Fort Collins is, it's messy. They're rotating between Braden Fowler-Nicolosi and Taj Bullock, and while both guys can make plays, that lack of consistency at the most important position is concerning. Meanwhile, San Diego State's Jaden Dedegal just carved up a Pac-12 defense for multiple big plays, including setting up Jordan Napier for an 80-yard bomb. Now let's talk about what really matters, the line movement and value. The power rankings actually give us some moderate value on San Diego State at minus 4.5. We're looking at about 1.4 points of value based on pure analytics versus the betting spread. That's not massive, but it's real money over time. Here's what's really telling, though. San Diego State's defense forced multiple turnovers against Cal, including a 97-yard pick six and a 35-yard fumble return for touchdown. Meanwhile, Colorado State just gave up a 76-yard rushing touchdown and a 74-yard passing score to UTSA. You see the pattern here? The home field advantage is only worth about 2 points for the Aztecs, which is actually below average. So we're not getting inflated by some massive home cooking situation. This spread feels pretty honest when you break it down. Weather's going to be perfect. 65 degrees, light winds, no precipitation. So we can throw out any concerns about conditions affecting either team's game plan. But here's my biggest takeaway, and this is where I think the real edge lies. Colorado State has now lost 2 games by a combined 3 points. That's the kind of bad beat variance that can absolutely destroy a team's confidence. You fail that 2-point conversion with less than 30 seconds left, that sticks with you. San Diego State, on the other hand, just had their best defensive performance in almost 50 years. Coach Sean Lewis is talking about emotional toughness and how his team responded to getting blown out by Washington State a few weeks back. That's the kind of momentum that carries over. The Rams do have Lloyd Avant, who looked solid with 96 yards on 10 carries, so they're not completely toothless on offense. But when you're facing a defense that just recorded consecutive home shutouts to start a season for the first time in Division I history, good luck with that ground game. I'm seeing a San Diego State team that just figured something out defensively, facing a Colorado State squad that's probably still thinking about that failed two-point try. The Aztecs are getting 4.5 points of respect they've earned, and the Rams are getting 4.5 points of sympathy they probably don't deserve. Sometimes the narrative and the numbers line up perfectly. This feels like one of those times. This Cincinnati-Iowa State matchup is fascinating because both teams are coming off completely opposite experiences that reveal everything about where they stand heading into Big 12 play. Let's start with what happened last weekend. Iowa State struggled to put away Arkansas State in what was a classic letdown spot. Coming off that emotional 16-13 win over Iowa, their biggest rivalry game, the Cyclones found themselves trailing for the first time all season. Rocco Becht had a rough third quarter despite finishing with 265 passing yards, and their kicker Kyle Conradi, who nailed that 54-yarder to beat Iowa, suddenly couldn't hit the broadside of a barn and left with an injury. That's the kind of inconsistency that shows up in your next big spot. Cincinnati, they were busy setting program records. 70 points against Northwestern State, with Brendan Sorsby throwing 5 touchdowns in the first quarter alone, went perfect 15 for 15 for 253 yards. 5 touchdowns in one quarter. That's video game stuff. But here's what's really interesting. They did this without their 2-time All-American nose tackle Dante Corleone, who's dealing with ankle issues. Now, the betting market has this exactly right from a power ranking perspective. Iowa State gets a small but real edge in overall team strength. Cincinnati gets their 2.5-point home field advantage, and we land right at pick'em. Perfect alignment, but the question isn't about the number. It's about which version of these teams shows up. The Cyclones' ground game gives them a reliable floor. Carson Hansen went for 116 yards on 18 carries. Abu Sama added 69 and the game-sealing touchdown. When Iowa State can establish that rushing attack, they control games. But that third-quarter breakdown against Arkansas State? That's concerning. Becht's touchdown streak is nice. 22 games now, but execution under pressure is what matters in conference play. Cincinnati's offensive explosion tells a different story. 7 passing touchdowns, 10 total touchdowns. And here's the kicker. 3 different quarterbacks combined for 362 passing yards. That depth could be huge if this becomes a shootout. But let's be honest. Northwestern State isn't exactly the Big 12. The situational spot heavily favors Cincinnati. Iowa State just came off an emotional high, showed letdown tendencies, and now they're making a 519-mile trip with an hour time adjustment. Meanwhile, Cincinnati gets a tune-up performance where they could rest starters and build confidence heading into their bye week. Here's where it gets interesting for bettors. Iowa State's defense hasn't been tested like this yet. Cincinnati just hung 70 on someone, and while that someone was overmatched, the execution was flawless. If Sorsby can maintain even half that efficiency, and if Iowa State brings that same third-quarter energy they showed against Arkansas State, this could get ugly fast. The weather's perfect, 83 degrees, light winds, no precipitation, nothing to complicate either team's game plan. This comes down to focus and execution. Cincinnati's at home, coming off their best performance with a quarterback who just went perfect in a game. Iowa State's coming off a concerning performance where they barely handled business against an inferior opponent. The Cyclones might be the better team on paper, but paper doesn't account for momentum, and right now, Cincinnati has all of it. So Wisconsin's heading into the Big House this weekend, and honestly, this might be the worst possible timing for the Badgers. We're looking at a team that's completely fallen apart at the seams, and Michigan's coming off a bye week hungry to make a statement. Let me paint you the picture of just how bad things have gotten in Madison. Billy Edwards Jr., their starting quarterback, lasted exactly 1 series last week before his knee gave out again. 1 series! And then Danny O'Neal comes in and throws for a whopping 120 yards with a pick, behind an offensive line that's starting 3 redshirt freshmen. I mean, Maryland got 6 sacks against these guys. 6! And here's the kicker. The fans are literally chanting Fire Fickle during home games now. Students are walking out early. This is Wisconsin football we're talking about, and they've lost 7 straight to Power 4 opponents. 7. Under Fickle, they're 15-15 overall. That's not Wisconsin football. Meanwhile, Michigan just dominated Nebraska on the road, rushing for 286 yards with 3 explosive touchdown runs. Bryce Underwood still developing as a passer, 12 of 22 for 105 yards. But when you're gashing teams for 75 and 54-yard touchdown runs, you don't need to throw much. Here's what's really interesting from a betting perspective. The power rankings have Michigan as a dominant tier team, and with their 2.7 home field advantage, they're getting even more of a boost than usual. The line's sitting at Michigan minus 6.5, but the analytics suggest there's about 0.8 of a point of value on Michigan here. Now, Wisconsin's dealing with that brutal minus 1 hour time adjustment coming from Central to Eastern time, and they're walking into this nightmare October stretch. After Michigan, they've got Iowa, number 1 Ohio State, and number 6 Oregon. If you're Wisconsin, you're probably already thinking about damage control. But here's where it gets really compelling for us as bettors. Wisconsin is not just bad. They're broken. Their quarterback situation is a complete disaster. Dylan Jones, their running back, got hurt too. They can't protect anybody behind that inexperienced line. And Michigan's defense? Wink Martindale had those guys bring in 7 sacks against Nebraska and forced their first interception of the season. The weather's perfect. 82 degrees, light winds from the south-southwest at 7 miles per hour. No excuses there. This is just going to come down to which team can execute, and right now, Wisconsin can't execute anything consistently. I keep coming back to Michigan's ground game. 286 yards rushing against a Nebraska defense that's actually pretty decent. When you can run the ball like that, and your defense is getting after the quarterback the way Michigan's been doing, you control the game script entirely. The total sitting around 51.5, and with Wisconsin's offensive struggles, I'm leaning under. But the spread? Michigan minus 6.5 feels light when you consider just how dysfunctional Wisconsin's offense has become. This feels like one of those spots where the struggling team gets completely overwhelmed on the road. Michigan's had 2 weeks to prepare, they're at home, and they're facing a Wisconsin team that honestly might not score 20 points.